Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Lisa Stutz, the director of the Royal Gorge Regional Museum History Center. Before I introduce Terri, I want to go over a few general housekeeping notes and an announcement. We do ask that you, if anybody has a cell phone, to please turn it off if you do. We are recording this program, and this will be available for you to see on our YouTube account through our website. And for a general announcement, I wanted to draw people's attention to our Friends of the Museum, our nonprofit organization who helps support our museum, is currently doing a silent auction of a dollhouse. It's currently in our reading room for those of you interested in looking at it or putting a bid on it. It is open. The silent auction closes on December 2nd at the 4-H fair. So with that, I'd like to introduce you to Terri Meeks, who is our volunteer and is also a member of the Friends of the Museum board. She has been doing a number of our genealogy programs in person initially, then COVID hit and did it virtually. She still does virtual programs for us, and this is the first in-person program that she's done at the museum for quite some time. So
3 years.
Several, yeah, I was gonna say, but it's very nice to have her back in person to do this special one on veterans and researching veterans. We always honor the veterans in our community. So with that, I'll turn it over to Terri. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lisa. Yeah, today we're going to look at military records, and hopefully I will be able to give you some idea of the different types of records that are available for you to research, as well as where to find those records. I'm going to have a lot of slides that will give you examples of the records, but the vast majority of the substantive information is on your handout. So I'll be referring to that throughout the presentation. So let's get started. So our country, unfortunately, from colonial times up to the present, has been involved in war. Virtually every generation has had to face war. And if you had an ancestor, or currently, if you were between the ages of 16 and 60, you might be able to find some military records for your family. Your military man, what you have to remember is that he might have served in more than one conflict. We had a neighbor in Fort Worth that was in World War II, the Korean War, and Vietnam. So don't overlook any of the wars between that age of 16 and 60. So you first want to determine which of your ancestors might have actually participated in a military action. And the best way to do that is to start by looking at your recent censuses. From 1900 through 1950, there are indications on the census records whether your family actually participated in a war. And we'll look at some of those. This is the example from the 1950 census. And this is the additional part that is at the bottom of the page. Not everyone filled out this information, but on the extreme right, we have the column. And we notice that this gentleman who appeared further up above was in both World War I and World War II. This other gentleman was not in World War I, but he was in World War II. So look at the 1950 census for perhaps your Korean War, your World War, or one of the other earlier wars. The 1930 census, likewise, has a column for veterans. No, they were not participants in or yes, they were. In this particular case, both of these gentlemen were in the World War. At the time, 1930, there was only one World War. There will also be notations for SP, for the Spanish-American War. There will be CW for the Civil War, MW for the Mexican War. And you do have a list of all of the wars on your handout. In 1920, they actually did censuses of domestic service. So this record happens to be from New Jersey, and it happens to be a transportation unit number 515. And all of these young men are privates serving in that unit. So look at that 1920 census. 1910 did the same thing. 1900, they actually did the overseas census. This one happens to be from Luzon in the Philippines, and it is for an Army unit, but they did both Army as well as Navy, the listing of the personnel. And what's really cool on this is, what was their home of record? And in my particular case, these were single young men whose parents were deceased. So they listed a sister as their home address. So you can cross-reference perhaps for someone. There was also an 1890 special census for Civil War veterans. Unfortunately, a lot of that has been lost, and only the states alphabetically from Kentucky through Wyoming have these records. And this was a surprise to me. That's why I'm sharing it with you. There is an 1840 census of pensioners from the Revolutionary War as well as other war service. And it is available at this particular web address, which is on your handout. Here is the 1890 census for special veterans. We see the listing of the veterans, what their rank was, and when they mustered in, when they were discharged from the service, and if it was a widow of a soldier, her name would appear and it would identify her specifically as the widow with the gentleman's name. Further information about any injuries, where they might have been discharged, is on the bottom of the page. Here is how you enter into that 1840 census of pensioners. These are PDF files that you can download to your computer, and they have fabulous information because the 1840 census, on the census, only the head of household is listed. The family members are not listed until 1850 census. What is really critical about this is, here are the names of the family heads. Here are the names of the pensioners. If those are different, we see Mr. Horn, Jonathan Horn, he's living in the household of Simon Ross. He's 85 years old. He would not appear in any other place in that 1840 census. So if you have a relative in any of the states that were listed on the previous page, this is a valuable, valuable piece of information. Where do we look for these records? The colonial wars, because there was not a federal state, the actual individual states maintain the records for the colonial wars, and they are usually housed in the state archives. And here again, we have to think about what side was your relative on. Was he a loyalist for England? Or because we were also allies or fighting against the French or the Spanish, which side of the war was he on? If he was in favor of the colonies, his records are going to be at the state archives. If not, they're going to be overseas. The state archives are usually located at major universities in the state or in the state capital. And I think we'll get to that in a second. The state archives also will house National Guard units as well as state militia units that were not called into federal service. So the Mexican War, there were many men that served in the militia, but they were not called into federal service. So their records are at the state archives rather than at the national archives. Confederate Civil War pension records are also at state archives, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in the future. There are 3 books that are available that will help you to locate where those state archives are. The easiest thing is to do a Google search, but these 3 books do also give valuable information about courthouses and state archives. The museum here actually has a copy of the handbook for genealogists. And this is what those 3 volumes look like. Records for the Revolutionary War up to 1912. Many of those are online at either Ancestry, Family Search, or on Fold3, which is also a subscription service. And they are microfilmed at the National Archives. And you can request those from the National Archives. I call out Fold3 because they are an excellent source for the Revolutionary War pension files. It is a subscription website, but it is available at the Family History Center here on Elm Street. And you can go in and access those records for free. They are working on the War of 1812. This is just an index card that is presented on Ancestry with far more information further on. This is an index card likewise from Family Search, which gives you the basic information about your particular relative. It is a pension file, the date of the pension file, the state in which he served. So it's an extraction of the record. It will tell you to go to Fold3. However, it's a subscription website, so you're not going to get any further unless you do have a subscription. Fold3, as I mentioned, is very, very strong for the Revolutionary War, working on the pension files for the War of 1812. At the moment, they do have free access. They are 85% complete, so they're not 100% complete, but they do have free access to the records that they have digitized and put up for 1812. So if you have a relative that served in that particular war, take advantage. And of course, the National Archives. They are the holder of all of these records. If you want to order the records, we have on your handout one address that you can look at, and it will refer you to an actual form through their eVetRecs section where you can actually order the records. In many cases, especially Civil War, Mexican War, Spanish-American War, you're going to have to actually write for these records. And I do encourage you, once you've confirmed that you do have a person that participated in any of these conflicts, do write for these records, because there are some secrets in them. These are the kinds of records that we are actually going to look at today. We have a list of the varying kinds of records that might be associated with military service. And for the most part, I am still talking about the Revolutionary War up to 1912. The other records do exist for those present wars, 1912 forward, and we'll talk about those in a few minutes. If anybody has any questions while I'm going along, please feel free to raise your hand and ask. Conscription. Some of the states did conscript individual men to participate in the Continental Army. There was no national conscription at that particular point in time. The central government in colonial times only had authority to conscript for naval impressment. Impressment is a prison type situation. So it was probably a very negative experience if anyone was impressed into the Navy. The Constitution does ratify conscription, and it was not needed until the Civil War. So that was the first time that we see conscription enforced. This is a Civil War draft registration record. And from your form, you see that there are 3 different classes of people, as well as the ages for these young men. And you'll notice on the form, it will indicate, it says Class 1. These are all young men who are either single or married. Here's another one of Class 1. We see a couple of older men, but they are single. And we also see remarks. Someone who has previously served and been discharged, someone who is blind in one eye, someone who's an alien, someone who says that his friends differ about his age. So at 34, the cutoff might have been 35. So he's trying to appear older or younger than he's supposed to be. Here's a Class 2, and we notice that these are all older gentlemen. But we do get their occupations and what their places of birth were. And here's someone that was drafted, but he has hired a substitute to go into the service for him. Not uncommon in both the Revolutionary War and the Civil War. You could buy a substitute. World War I draft registrations. There were 3 drafts during World War I, and they will be labeled A, B, and C according to the years. The numbers refer to the state, the district, and the local draft divisions. World War II draft registrations. There were 6 of those. There was a 7th final one that was not really officially recognized as a draft at the time, but we see various family information. One of the great things is that you get someone's birth date, their place of birth, and the state where they were born. This predates birth certificates for the most part. So these records can potentially be extremely valuable. Who is the next of kin that they are listing? Is it their father, their mother, a wife, a brother-in-law? It will give that information. The serial number in the upper left was a federal number that was given for a lottery purpose, and their order number was from the local draft board. On your handout, I have noted it will help you to determine exactly which draft your people fell in, but not only were there the years, but there were letters that might appear with the order number to give you further information. The other thing is with these records, don't forget to look at the back. Even when you're doing census research, any kind of research, always look at a couple of preceding pages, always look at a couple of succeeding pages, because there might be more information about your family. In the case of the World War II records, it gives the physical description. And if there are any unique identifying marks, that he's missing part of his earlobe, that he's blind, any kinds of scars, it helps in the identification should he be killed in action. So, there are enlistment registers. A lot of these appear in the 19th century. They start in the early part of the 1800s, maybe as early as the 1820s, and go completely through the end of the century and into the beginning of the 20th century. I think the latest ones that I've seen have been about 1904. And we see that they give the person's name, their nativity, where they were born. All of these young men are coming from Ireland, what their ages, their occupations, where they are actually enlisting in the service, and the length of time that they will be serving, they will be asked to serve. This can go anywhere from 30 days to 5 years. Americans typically, the people in charge typically believed that war would be short. So they originally conscripted for only 30 days or so. Well, wars lasted much longer than 30 days. We'll give also a brief physical description. It will tell what unit they are assigned to and the company within that unit, if they are discharged, if they have deserted, and if they've been apprehended, if they've deserted, and if they have enlisted or in previous times, if they were discharged, where they are discharged. World War II enlistments, for the most part, at least on Ancestry, they are extracted records. The National Archives, through their website, actually has pretty much this exact same form. Okay, this one does have his service number on it. That service number is key and critical, especially for World War II, World War I up through current, because that service number, if you write to the National Personnel Records Center, that will help them to find the individual record. It is the easiest place to find the service number. And it will help when writing to them. It will help it. Many people are named John Smith. It will identify your specific John Smith. So let's look at some of the index cards that we see. These are the top level cards that will let you know that they've got some other information. As to how much information there is, some of it is scant, some of it is detailed. Here is one from the Revolutionary War. We don't see very much information on the index card. But by the time we get to the War of 1812, we see a card that has a little bit more information. We get when he enlisted, when he was discharged, what units he actually, and you'll notice the units have people's names, Randolph's Company, Williams Company. We'll see where he's resided, who his wife was, and when her maiden name, and where they got married, and when he died, and when she died. So there's more information on simply the index card at this point. We have Civil War cards. We see what unit the person was serving in, and we see that he applied for an invalid pension, and this is his application number. But he did not qualify. There would be a number in this slot for certificate number. Don't overlook these records. He applied. He had to fill out the paperwork to make that application, and that application does still exist, whether he qualified for the pension or not. Here is one from the Civil War, and we see he had service in 2 different units. He applied for an invalid pension in 1890 and was actually granted a pension. When he died, his widow applied for a widow's pension, and she too qualified. Yes, Lee.
Quick question. This is telling us that they applied and they got their pension. Is it possible to get a copy of the application?
Yes. And that's where you write to the National Archives. Yes. Yes. Some of the we'll talk about it later. Some of the compiled service records are available online. Most of the pension records are not. So those are 2 different sets of records, and we're going to be talking about those. One of the things about this, she's applying for the widow's pension in 1909, gives you a clue as to when he died. It may not be the specific date that he died on, but it helps you narrow down the scope. Here again, 1909 is prior to many death certificates in many states. Spanish-American War, we get the blank card again. We do simply get the unit. He was in Company G of the 2nd Ohio Infantry, and he was a corporal. But it tells you that there are records for his service. Compiled service records. These are essentially military records. Don't overlook them and don't negate them, because I did ask for compiled service records for one of my relatives. And it turns out that his mother had not heard from him when he was in the Civil War. And she wrote a letter to his commanding officer and said, "Where's my boy? I haven't heard from him." It had her name, her address in Ireland, and I had no other way of tracing that further generation back. So don't overlook the compiled service records. My relative in that same file applied for 2 medals and had to write an entire biography, and it told exactly when and where he was born, when he immigrated to the United States. Don't overlook the compiled service records, even if they are primarily military in nature. On Ancestry for the Revolutionary War, if you enter your ancestor's name and nothing comes up, you might try going to the state from the index card, the state where he might have served from, and the actual unit that he might have served from, and do an actual search that way. You'll have to go page by page, and it is a laborious process, but if you didn't come up with the name, it's worth doing. Here is what one of those service records look like. You notice we have the whole list of cards. For every one of those cards, there is an accompanying card that will talk about pay, muster, when they entered the service, when they left. And these are usually monthly. And are they present for the roll call? They might also record receipts. I received my pay from the officer in charge. Likewise, you're going to see for all of these that these are very, very similar. War of 1812, what unit he's participating in, his card number. We see a muster roll, and there are 3 additional enclosures, one about pay, one about his discharge certificate, and one with miscellaneous information. In the War of 1812, you might also find, this is a pay voucher that's handwritten. He received, Henry Hancock got $17.80 for his service in Captain Mott's company of Mississippi Territory Militia for his service of 2 months and 7 days, starting in the 20th of January in 1815, from January to March. And he has signed. Mr. John Anderson has gotten the pay from Henry. Did I skip one? Nope. Likewise, in the Mexican War, there are very, very few records online for the Mexican War. In terms of ancestry, we only have these 5 entities. We have 4 states and the Mormon organization from Utah. So from Mississippi, compiled service record, we see the card numbers, and we actually get the compiled service records. Very, very similar, muster roll, another month of muster roll, and when they actually were present, and he actually was mustered out at Nashville. Short terms of service in the Mexican War. Civil War for the Union, we see those same kinds of cards with references to Fold 3. But the compiled service records are, for some states, are online. And just as we've seen before, we get those monthly muster rolls, and whether they are important, whether they are present or not, when they might be discharged. He's at a hospital. You might see little information. Shot through the right ear. Sounds pretty serious to me. You might also get treatment from when they were entered into a hospital. They were administering quinine and brandy, hoping he would feel better. Unfortunately, his health declined extremely rapidly, and he actually died on March 18th of 1864. And it gives they were very, very frank in their descriptions. Newspapers, too, at the time, were very, very open about descriptions. Confederate, this Confederate compiled service records are online through Ancestry. By the time we get to the Spanish-American War, we simply get a card that indicates what branch of the service he is in, what his name is, and where he enlisted, what unit he served in, and if there was any action. He was not in any actual campaign engagements, for example, and he didn't receive any wounds. So Spanish-American War lasted from April to August of 1898, so he escaped, probably without even being sent to Cuba or the Philippines. There are some Navy records and some Navy compiled service records. Here is one for Mr. Landsman in the Spanish-American War with essentially the same information, but on a simple card, and he deserted. Here's one from the Marine Corps with a very extensive list of engagements. He was in the Philippines in this particular time, so saw a lot of action. There was a small Mexican punitive campaign in 1916. These were mostly National Guard and militia units, and they too have a different form for the compiled service record. Many of them were not, the action was so short-lived that many of them were not called to active service. World War I, we see Army and the various units that he might have been assigned to, as well as overseas time. That overseas time indicates that there's going to be one of those ship lists, a ship list either transporting to or coming home. So look for further information. Turn over to the second page. Don't neglect doing that previous page and following page, because there might be additional information about your person's service. There are records for World War I Navy service, and it will talk about perhaps the ship that the person served on. And you can actually get pictures of the ships. The next major group that gives us the most genealogical information is pension applications. And this is where the National Archives comes in and is of primary importance. They have the records from 1775 through 1912. And you might find additional information. You might find not only the narrative events during the service, but people may have provided birth, especially marriage certificates, to prove. The wife had to prove that she was her husband's spouse in order to collect his widow's pension, her widow's pension. You might get pages of family Bibles or letters that might be included. You're always going to get the death affidavits from witnesses attesting to the fact that, yes, he did serve. I knew him for such a period of time. He did serve in this particular unit. I knew his wife, etc. There are 3 types of pensions at this particular point. There is disability, service, and widows. Most of those are self-explanatory. And I do refer to you to, on your handout, I have done 2 other presentations on military records, and one of them is specifically on what's hidden in the pension records. If you are interested in knowing more about pensions, the Hidden in the Pension Records talks about all of the pension legislation for each one of the wars. You have to realize that the government, in its ultimate wisdom, allotted pensions many, many years after the end of the conflict. They waited for most people to die. Here is a Revolutionary War pension file. And going to what we just talked about, this gentleman talks about how he was born in Pennsylvania on the 7th of August in 1757. He moved and he lived in this other county until the 15th day of September of 1777, 20 years old, when he enlisted in the service of the United States as a substitute for Michael Graham. Might have gotten paid to be a substitute. So, little tidbits, it does tell you when he was born. There's definitely no birth certificate at this particular point in time. When applying for pensions, they might have talked about when the couple actually got married. They had 13 children. And I apologize for the quality of the image, but we see the birth years, and in a couple of cases, we get the actual birth dates for the children in the 1700s. Fills in your family tree. Here's a War of 1812 widow's pension application for Miss Susan Slight. And you'll notice this is the War of 1812, and she's being awarded a pension in 1866. Some 50 years later. Yes, Penny?
So, going back to the pension application where the dates were, I run into where like there might be like the births of children.
Mm-hmm.
There might be like as much as like maybe a year's difference between what it says on the application and what it might say on other paperwork. So, what do you suggest? What do you recommend when you run into all of the dates?
It depends on who is providing the information. One of the best rules or pieces of advice, if the individual is providing the information, take it closest to the actual event. So if it's the individual and he's participating in World War I, or let's use the census as an example. You see in the census where somebody is 20 years old one year and he's 27 in the next census, and he's 35 in the next census. Especially women, they get younger and younger with each decade. So you take the earliest one, the one that is closest to that person. When people have passed away, it's how much. You have to weigh the validity of the information. If there's missing data, in that particular example that I showed, it was a pension file where 3 brothers applied for their father's pension. It was not granted. It was refused. But the 3 brothers all agreed on the names and dates. So look for other information, perhaps more information in a pension file to see if there is a definitive, a more definitive answer. So, but yeah, we're 50 years later, more than 50 years later. But we do see, it's a simple typed form where you fill in the blanks, but still, we get Susan's name, we get her husband's service from 1814, where they were married. She married in Philadelphia on July of 1822. He passed away on the 27th of August in 1836. So he's been dead for 30 years, and she's just now getting his pension. And yes? No, it is a combination of both. Not everyone applied for a pension. They might have qualified for one, but they had to apply for it. If they didn't, the government didn't go looking for them. And in some cases, it depends on their financial situation. At this point, she's been dependent. She's been dependent on the assistance of relatives and friends. So she's 62 years old at this point, and she needs additional help. So she may have applied this late. That's why I refer you to the various pension laws that are covered in the other presentation, because it will help you to narrow down when she might have actually applied and why. Oops. And this is a witness statement attesting to the fact that this person, George, knew Henry and knew his wife, and that he indeed did serve during the War of 1812. So look at those. Who are the witnesses? Is it possible it might be a family member or a neighbor from the 1800s? So potential clues for other ways to look for additional family information. The Mexican War. For the most part, Family Search had some information about the Mexican War. We see a couple of different states. We see Iowa, which we had not seen before. They do have the compiled service records. The only service pension files that they have are for the Mormon Battalion from Utah. The other pension files are on or at the National Archives. And we see the application, a deposition from a wife. We'll look at some details on it. Her husband, William, she's the widow of William Kelly, died in June of 1899. He was in the Mormon Battalion between 46 and 47. The wife was born in 1837 in Denmark, and she came to the United States, settled in Utah. She married him in 1857, and as with many Mormons, it was a plural marriage. So you get to see who the other wives were in this particular case. That file went on for like 20 pages. Civil War pension files. This one happens to be for an invalid. He fell off the horse that was owned by Colonel Alcott, and he was taking care of the horse, and then the horse fell on his legs, and it ruptured the veins in his legs, and it also did damage to his bowels. So he's applying for an invalid pension. Sounds like he deserves one. Also, we have widows' pensions. And we look at these and we do see the service dates and the company that the person served in. But we get some of these clues. Both had been previously married, but the marriage in each case had been dissolved by death. This happens to be in my own family, and I did not know that from the census information. I found his second wife. I didn't know he had a first wife, and that he had multiple children that had been born and died prior to. So read these records carefully. Women. Women also served in the military. Those that were not recognized in active Army service, they worked behind the scenes. Women from day one have been nurses, have been dietitians. They've been feeding people. So it's important to think about women and looking for their records as well. Eunice Vipond is buried here in the Lakewood Cemetery, and this is her Civil War tombstone. She did. She served as Eunice Hardenbrook, her maiden name, and her records are under Eunice Vipond. She was a nurse in the diet kitchen. There are additional sets of information to look at. In this particular case, we see Eunice is living in Silver Cliff. This is at the 8th National Convention, and I apologize, I do not remember the year for that, but it's from a journal of Army nurses, a unique document that will give you some information. After the Civil War, there was the Women's Relief Corps that was set up, and they too had conventions and meetings. And poor Eunice has applied to the relief fund, and she is getting the sum of $50 to be placed in a bank in that city under the supervision of Clara Coulter, past department president of Colorado and Wyoming. So, Confederate records. It is important to know which side of the Civil War your ancestors were fighting on. If they fought on the Confederate side, their records, especially their military service records, may be at the National Archives, but they're going to be in a completely separate set of documents from the Union Army. The government did not recognize Confederate service, the federal government, until 1959. So, but starting in the late 1800s, Confederate states decided to provide pensions for Confederate veterans. They were paid in the state in which the veteran was living. He might have served in Alabama, but if he was living at the time in Georgia, the state of Georgia is going to have those records. So here again, those state archives. And for additional information about each state and where this information is, you can refer to that, which is on your handout. There are pension payment cards. How much did these people get when they got their pensions? This is that case of Mary, who is the second wife of Daniel, and she got a pension in 1893 when he was killed in an accident. She got $36 on the 4th of the month in 4 quarters of the year. These are in quarters. So, until she died in 1918. I guess it was 1917, actually. So, not a whole heck of a lot of money. If you are interested in the Civil War, the National Park Service has the Soldiers and Sailors database. This is a very, it's a useful database. It gives you the outline of where your people might have settled or served from. If you have an ancestor named John Smith, you're going to have to plow through quite a few to see if you can recognize where your person was. But they do both soldiers, sailors, and what's great is they do regimental histories. They have brief histories of each of the regiments from the Civil War and the action that each one of those regiments saw during the Civil War. Google, as well as other resources, do have unit histories, total regiments, talks about what companies were actually formed, where they were formed, and what service they saw. What about the Navy during the Civil War? Well, there are no compiled service records for the Navy or for the Marine Corps. This website, which I have included, does give information about the ships, when they were commissioned, where they were actually built. There are some pictures. There are a few muster rolls in this volume, but by and large, it's sketchy history. But if you happen to know the ship that your ancestor served on, this will give you meat to add to the bones. The Spanish-American War, we get forms, simple fill-in forms, but we get Albert Jones, and he lives in Pennsylvania, or he actually lives in California, but he served from the state of Pennsylvania. What's interesting on this particular one is he listed in the regular army in November of 1898, and then he also served in the Navy or the reserves from 1918 to 1922. So he's going to have two sets of pension records in his files. And it does give his date of birth, and in this case, his wife, and what her maiden name was. So read these records thoroughly. We get to the hard part. 1912 to the present. There are some records online. There are very few records online. I would refer you to the card catalog at either Ancestry or Family Search and look at each one of the states and see if they have any World War I, World War II, Vietnam. I doubt they're going to have anything from the Middle East. See if there are any records. The records for 1912 to the present are held at the National Personnel Record Center, which unfortunately had a fire in 1973, which destroyed a lot of the World War I and World War II records. I haven't seen anything recently about it, but it was my understanding at some previous time that the Vietnam era records were the first records to be computerized. Unfortunately, the computer still exists, but there's no other computer that can read the data. Now, whether they are working on that or not, I do not know. But yes, it was probably one of those large UNIVAC computers. So information may be sketchy. If you have served in the military, or your father or a relative during this time period, and you have information from your own service or their service, contact the National Personnel Record Center because they may want the information from you for their files and for future generations. With the National Personnel Records Center, because of Privacy Act, there may be restrictions as far as whether you can get the records for your military person. They may ask, is the person deceased? If you're asking for your own records, there's no problem with this. But if you're asking for someone from your family, they may want to know whether they are deceased, and they may ask you to prove your relationship to this person. So, we get clues from headstones in cemeteries. We see, for example, Ms. Smilinich is buried here at Lakeside, and she is a veteran of the Korean War. We also have the Department of Veterans Affairs, BIRLS, burials, death files, which do give us the years of service that people participated in. When I said to look at the states, that is one of the things I did. And I specifically looked for women, so I apologize if I do not have that many records at this point about men. But this is from Montana, and it's a World War I record. It is very sketchy. She was a nurse, Mary Agnes Kelly. She lived in Montana, but she was from New York. World War I think she was born in 1886 or 96. She would have been pretty old at 86. And she was a nurse at Camp Lewis in Washington until her discharge. So, training camp is what that one says. Principal sailors. So, when I mentioned World War I service earlier and people having overseas service, ship lists. They were sent overseas, they returned from overseas. Those ship lists, many of them are now available on Ancestry. This ship list happens to be a bunch of nurses, women, who are coming back to Hoboken, New Jersey from Brest, France in 1919, after the end of the war. This one is from the state of Utah, and it is for World War II service. Helen Clark, when she enlisted in Washington, D.C., she's from Utah, but she enlisted in Washington, D.C., who her parents are, when she was discharged at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. Here again, a nurse. Another nurse serving in North Carolina from April of 45 to April of 46, and the various duties that she performed during that time. Tells a real story about her and what she might have seen. I apologize again for the quality of this. The quality of the original is not that great. New Mexico has done a great job, so if you have any relatives that might have been in New Mexico, this is where to find some of the military records. This is for a woman, Anna N., and she is a telephone switchboard operator in the European theater. She has spent over 1 year and 6 months and 20 days in the European theater. If any of you have read Switchboard Soldiers, those were World War I telephone operators. These women served just like Miss Hill did. She was not part of the regular army and did not qualify for a pension. Not until Jimmy Carter's administration in 1980.
They didn't get commissioned.
That is correct. The museum of New Mexico, their historical society, asked women to fill out questionnaires. Actually, they asked all service members to fill out questionnaires. So we get her education, we get her service, and she too has done foreign service. And here is her actual honorable discharge. And this lady is an airplane engine mechanic in the European theater for 1 year, 3 months, 22 days. No pension till 1980.
So the pension, the lack of pension basis that she's a woman, or is that job?
Yes. Only nurses, and it wasn't until 1901 when nurses actually became full-fledged members of the military and were recognized for their service. Many of them in previous wars had served with volunteer units, so they did qualify for pensions. But starting pretty much with World War I, World War II, the military didn't want women. They were a problem. So they were not recognized. And as I said, it was one of my closing remarks. But here we see her serving. She did not qualify for a pension, but we actually had a picture of her. There were also 12 national homes that were established for the care of disabled veterans. Their entrance and discharge was completely voluntary. So you see in some of these records where people checked in for a couple of months, checked out for a couple of months, checked in for a couple of months, checked back in. So here is one of those forms, and it gives their name, what unit they served in, and exactly what type of ailment they are suffering from. We get a physical description and who is their next of kin, and we see the in and out, in and out, in and out. And there may be some general remarks down in the bottom. If the person died in one of the national homes, that too is recorded. There are also muster rolls for the Marines. We talked earlier about those 1800s, for the most part, Army records, but other records do exist from that same time period. If you have someone that was a career military person, returns from military posts every month had to submit reports as to the manpower and the availability of that manpower. So if your person was an officer, they might be recorded in some of the information. If they were an enlisted person, if they deserted, if they were sick and were sent to hospital, if they were transferred to another unit, the bottom of the page will have that kind of information as well. In the general remarks, you do get the individual units and what they might be doing during the course of that month. Troops C, E, L, and M with detachment troops. B and G of the 7th Cavalry left Fort Grant, Arizona Territory at 9 a.m. en route to Huntsville, Alabama, per the orders from headquarters, arriving at Wilcox, Arizona Territory at 2 p.m. So we've marched 28 miles that day. So I have a career military officer. I know where he was every month of his life. I know more about him than I do about myself. Navy muster rolls for World War II. These are sketchy. They're not every single one, but if your relative falls on one of these, it is fortuitous, and you get great information. What ship they're serving on. National Guard service. Here again, we're looking at individual states. This is from New York State, and they have the records for people that served in the National Guard. Hospital admission records. Was somebody wounded? Did somebody succumb or have disease? And were entered into the hospital. Finally, we have applications for burial benefits. Did one of the widows or a widower, because we're talking potentially about women's service at this point, did they apply for burial benefits for their person? And it gives their service information, what unit they were in and how long they served. Clues to help you look back. And we also have headstone applications with similar types of information for when their service was. So this pretty much gives you an idea of all the types of records that might help you in finding your military veteran. I also want to encourage you to look at books, especially Civil War, prior to Civil War, depending on the state that they served from. There have been thousands of books written about military service. This Cheyenne and Horse Soldiers, my relative that was in the cavalry, it talks about them leaving Fort Leavenworth, and it talks about what music the band was playing when they left the fort. This is prior to the Civil War, what color the horses were in each one of the units, and it goes blow by blow through the Indian campaign. So don't neglect books. I also have a couple of examples of newspaper reporting. Spanish-American War, that was the biggie. Photography started during the Civil War, but it was photography in newspapers during the Spanish-American War where it took off in terms of newspapers. Since the Spanish-American War was short-lived, they had articles about whole units deploying, and they listed who were all those hometown soldiers that were being transported to Cuba. Anytime injuries, deaths, promotions, these were covered in your small local newspapers. So scan those newspapers to add depth to your ancestors' stories, or look at your own stories. So with that, to the gentlemen that are here today that might have served, we thank you, and we hope that you will enjoy some cake with us and celebration. So, are there any questions? Yes, Steve. I honestly don't know. I will do further research and get back with you. I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to that. Yeah, it is. So thank you. Something to go forward. Yes, sir.
When you was sharing, I think that was called City, and this veteran, he was English and his wife one, or when they saw women, we had several other guys. So if someone, they were struggling or hardship, and they filed a pension, how do they determine which wife's going to get the pension?
Number one, did all the multiple wives file for a pension? I seriously doubt it. And in most cases, the wives are all living in a communal area. So one wife, might have applied for the pension, and it indeed might have been spread through the whole community of wives. So, not at even $36 a month, especially if you've got to share it. Ah.
His wife threw them surviving pension. And we got a card in my book in my common form. They don't pay them but $16 maybe a month.
Yes. In doing some of the research, my relative that was he was in the service for 43 years, started as an enlisted man. He was in the Buffalo Soldiers, and the enlisted men earned $8 a month. Cavalry boots cost more than $8. So it took more than a month's pay to buy just your boots. And the first pair was, and heaven forbid that anything should happen to the horse. And you might have to pay because of negligence for the horse. But, regular pay, even not, yeah.
I know, I was I got an NCO academy, so I became an officer. And one of the first things I was assigned to was artillery. And I was up at Fort Burnsby, Wyoming, and one of the enlisted said, "Sir, would you like to drive this artillery down back?" And I said, "Well, I don't know. I really haven't got a hold of it. Let me see if I can forward it." So I'm going over here, having a good time. I thought, man, like happening or something. The big tube on the 8-inch artillery gun is just clogged because I'm going pretty fast, trying to keep up with a couple others that were returning all the artillery guns. There's a big spin on the back like a boulder. So when I pull into the maintenance yard for storage, this colonel comes up to me and with a brand new second lieutenant and says, "Do you have a license for this?" I said, "No, sir, but yeah, I'm kind of a long group. I should be a driver." And he says, "What do you have a license for?" "Well, I've got one for the sedan and a Jeep." And he said, "That's all you've got a license for." Now, an enlisted person, you as an officer, you will pay for if you wreck or damage this artillery gun. And you know what this gun is? It's not like $1 million. This is 30, 50, 40 years ago or more. And I said, he said, "Now, if you was enlisted, then you're good to go." So, but if you're an officer, you will pay for this mission. And I said, "Okay, lesson learned." Thank you, sir.
And then Carol,
Oh.
So, we did bring some family memorabilia for the service members in our family. If you would like to come up, we do have a diary with we have a first-hand account of some of the wars, some books, as well as other memorabilia. So I invite y'all to enjoy some cake. And thank you.